Welcome to The Critique. Today we looked at a really intense piece, part panel discussion, part research deep dive, all critiquing how unreliable jailhouse informants are used, zeroing in on Paul Scalnik, a convicted con man and sex offender, and what his case means for wrongful convictions.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
So let's jump right in. One thing that struck me is how the core story, Skalnik's pattern of lies, sometimes its power gets diluted because the structure immediately shifts to these broader legal complaints.
Right, I felt that too. You have this incredibly specific, shocking story about Skalnik, what he did, the cases, and then boom, we're suddenly talking about like Article 1 versus Article 3 courts or defense lawyers failing to object. It's a bit abrupt.
Exactly. That jumpiness, it kind of fragments the narrative, doesn't it? It lessens the sustained impact of the Skalnik evidence itself. We hear about the 37 cases, the death sentences, the dismissed molestation charge,
All incredibly damning details.
and then immediately we're pulled out into this wider, more abstract legal theory. You lose that tight focus on the case study almost instantly.
Yeah, the emotional thread gets broken. So, structurally, the suggestion I think is pretty clear. Dedicate a solid, uninterrupted block just to Skalnik. Lay out the case, the facts, the data from groups like the Innocence Project first.
Let it breathe.
Exactly. Let the sheer awfulness of the specifics, like James Daly getting convicted even though the prosecution knew Skalnik was a liar, let that really land and establish the problem before you pivot.
Yeah. Like, take Daly's situation. You've got the conviction, then later hearings are granted, but the key witness won't testify because his mother is there? That level of absurdity, that cynicism, it needs its own moment before we start talking about, say, the 95% conviction rate statistic.
Right. Sequence it properly. And that chilling stat you mentioned, nearly a quarter of death row ex-honorees convicted using informants, that should come right after the Selnick data. Bang! Connect the specific case to the systemic failure directly. Don't scatter those points.
And then, those personal anecdotes the hosts share, the traffic court observation about hearsay, the Pennsylvania v. Mims discussion, those are insightful, but maybe group them later. Perhaps in a section like what this means for the accused, Keep the main Selnick thread tight first.
Yeah, that makes sense. Keep the expose focused, then broaden out. If the audience is hooked by Skalnik, they'll follow you into the wider legal arguments. But push them there too soon, and you risk losing that initial momentum.
Okay, so structure and pacing, that's one major area. But fixing the flow doesn't help if the tone puts people off right at the start. Let's talk about the rhetoric.
I mean, I get the passion. It definitely conveys this deep, righteous anger about the whole situation. And honestly, isn't some of that aggressive language kind of necessary to capture how messed up this system feels? We don't want to tone police the outrage away entirely, right?
Is there for a reason. But the potential downside is that the consistent use of really strong, polemical language, it might alienate listeners who are maybe skeptical or just coming to this fresh, people who could be persuaded by the facts.
Okay, so the weakness is that phrases like fucking snitches or lying low-life criminal, and especially that recurring Hitler's willing executioners comparison, while powerful, they could make some listeners focus more on the host's anger than on the evidence itself, the evidence about incentivized testimony being unreliable. The tone could potentially overshadow the legal substance.
Exactly. So the suggestion isn't to lose the outrage, but maybe to reframe it. Let the shocking facts carry more of that emotional weight. Reserve the really provocative labels for moments where the argument is already fully built on data. The goal is to show how the system's actions, like giving parole to someone like Skalnik for testimony, are outrageous in themselves, regardless of what label you slap on it.
Right. Let the facts indict the system. So, for example, when talking about why informants lie, maybe lead with that Innocence Project finding. Rebecca Brown talking about the largely secretive system, how benefits often aren't delivered until after the trial.
Which lets the informant testify they aren't getting anything.
Exactly. That shows the systematic deceit, the procedural loophole, without needing to immediately call someone a name. It's more powerful, in a way.
Yeah, it really is. And instead of just saying lying fucks about prosecutors, maybe focus on the institutional pattern. Like investigator James Ferris eventually refused to use Scalnik, right? But the system allowed him in 37 cases before that. That points to a systemic issue, negligence, maybe even complicity, which feels more substantial than just personal insults.
Let the pattern of institutional failure speak for itself. In that Hitler's willing executioners idea, it's a huge comparison. If it's used, maybe frame it more as a structured philosophical point later on. Like, build the case first. Show how tolerating these small systemic lies, like plea deals that are essentially false confessions, can create an environment where bigger injustices become possible. That makes it feel less like just an angry outburst and more like a considered, albeit stark conclusion drawn from the evidence.
That feels much stronger. It turns raw reaction into a reasoned, if very intense, argument. Okay, so if we nail the structure and calibrate the rhetoric, that's huge. But then there's the what now question. Let's look at the call to action, the reform section. It critiques the problem well, but feels a bit stuck.
Yeah, it critiques the proposed safeguards like pretrial hearings, tracking benefits, but dismisses them as just conditioning, basically window dressing. And then the actual suggestions veer towards the, well, highly impractical, like start hanging motherfuckers. Is the risk here that it leaves the listener feeling powerless? Like, if the regulations won't work and the only alternative is extreme violence, what can I actually do?
That's the gap right there. So the suggestion is maybe acknowledge those proposed safeguards, explain precisely why they fall short based on the analysis already presented, like tracking is useless if the benefits are secret or vaguely promised, then pivot. Pivot to advocating for a clearer, more fundamental legal change that actually aligns with the core critique about due process.
Okay, that makes sense. And building on that, the material touches on needing a third-party impartial witness, especially when discussing O.J. Simpson. That idea of neutrality seems key.
Definitely.
So if the core problem identified is the incentive corrupting testimony and destroying neutrality, then maybe the logical, actionable reform isn't just better tracking, but arguing for eliminating all incentivized testimony in criminal cases. Just get rid of the practice that creates the bias in the first place. That feels like a big but potentially system-compliant transformative goal.
That definitely aligns with the intensity of the critique, moving from just regulating the problem to trying to abolish the practice itself. And since there's so much focus on prosecutors not disclosing deals and the high conviction rates, what about specific accountability measures?
Yeah, like what?
Well, for instance, what if failure to disclose any benefit promised to an informant, explicit, implicit, even just favorable treatment down the line, meant automatic disbarment for the prosecutor? That's concrete. It puts teeth into the disclosure rules and focuses on professional ethics.
That's sharp, high-stakes, focused consequence. I like that.
And maybe use Scalnik's own end story getting arrested years later for not registering as a sex offender, found with fake IDs. Use that to hammer the point home. See? Even when the system finally catches one of these guys, it often doesn't undo the damage done to people like James Daly. It shows why we need fundamental structural change, not just catching bad actors after the fact.
Absolutely. That reframes the ending. It moves from just venting frustration to outlining a clear, urgent case for specific legal and professional reforms. It gives the listener something concrete to think about or even advocate for.
Look, this is important, powerful material addressing a critical issue. It absolutely deserves to have the maximum possible impact. So, recapping, we see 3 key opportunities here to really elevate it.
First, tighten that structure. Really anchor the narrative in the specifics of the Scalnik case first. Let its depths and devastation fully register before expanding outwards to the broader systemic critiques. Give that core story the space it needs.
Second, think about calibrating the rhetoric. Let the incredibly strong, well-researched facts about the system's failures, the negligence, the deceit, carry more of the persuasive weight. Maintain the righteous anger, sure, but maybe use language that keeps even a skeptical audience engaged with the evidence.
And third, sharpen that call to action. Move beyond dismissing current safeguards towards advocating for concrete, fundamental changes. Things like eliminating incentivized testimony entirely or demanding real professional consequences like disbarment for non-disclosure. Make the path forward feel more defined and actionable.
This is already strong work. Taking these points, Focusing the structure, tuning the rhetoric, and solidifying the call to action can make it even more compelling. We genuinely encourage you to refine it further and would be very interested to review the next iteration.